So with an update on racing surfaces and discussion about a move towards track superintendent certification, we do have Dr. Mick Peterson, Executive Director, Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, Director of Ag Equine Programs, University of Kentucky, and Professor of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Peterson's research links traditional understanding of engineering mechanics and materials to the biomechanics of animals. So I just want to say in more simple terms, what Dr. Peterson does is he has an extensive background in the research of the biomechanics of the horse and how those biomechanics are affected by exercise and racing and training surfaces. Dr. Peterson's greatest passion is for increasing the understanding of the consistency of racing and equestrian sports surfaces. He collaborated with Dr. Wayne McElwraith at Colorado State University to found the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory, a nonprofit organization supported by the racing industry. Please welcome Dr. Peterson.
All right, I won't be offended if some of you decide to go home and watch the video if that's your preference. So, I'm going to start out by talking about some of the key risks to racing. I mean, I'm the last speaker today, so I get to do a little bit of summary here before I talk about the details of surfaces. And the other part of this, and really where the superintendent's meeting comes in, is in the sustainability of the model that we have for our sport. We need people. Racing has to have people to watch races, bet races, and own racehorses. You know, that's our goal. That's our outcome. That's our why for our equation, is our loss or gain for racing. What are the causes of those? Well, you've heard some discussion. This is the Welfare and Safety Summit, but fan experience and integrity is central to what our sport and the expectations of the participants in the sports. And when I say participants, I mean the people in the stands, I mean the owners, I mean the trainers. The integrity of the betting process is absolutely critical. Having the integrity, the medication issues, the overall integrity of the sport. But the two things we're focused on today are rider safety and animal welfare. And when I talk animal welfare, it's not just equine safety, it's the second careers. When we talk about what we listened to before, this is central to the perception. This is the central opportunity as well as risk to racing, is understanding it isn't the world that existed 20, 30 years ago. It's a different world. It's a world that has expectations both for the safety of the riders and the participants, the equine participants. So the way to look at safety is it's part of a much bigger story. It's part of, if you care about racing, it's critical to protect all of the athletes. What Peter Hitchens so clearly described is this interrelationship. Horse injuries are a risk to the riders. That was one of the big pieces of the pie that Dr. Hitchens talked about. So by protecting the horse, we're protecting the rider, and we're protecting the sport. Cause and effect. The inputs are safety, the output is the future of the sport. So how do we focus this? There's limited resources, there's limited time, and we need to understand where the risks are. What are the risks? Where can we have the most gain for the quickest benefit to the sport? I'm talking about surfaces. I'm not talking about surfaces because it is the most important risk factor. We talked about those risk factors. It was on a long list. But we've got a lot of unsolved problems. We're looking for solvable problems, places that we can have an immediate impact. Dr. Hitchens, again, and I did not coordinate this, but it's in her publications. If we talk about rider injuries, the low-hanging fruit, it's gates. We can think about the operations of the gates, the staffing, assistant starters, padding. Those are immediate changes we can make to protect the athletes. Surfaces fall into the same category. They're important, but they're not the most important, but they impact every horse every day that's running on the surface. Pre-race exams are the other thing that fall into that same category. Every horse benefits from targeted pre-race exams. Tracks can also have the issue that they can be an excuse for other problems that are avoided. So if we talk about tracks, we've got this constituency. We've got the owners, the track operators, the public. Everybody wants decent tracks. There's no constituency for inadequate, inconsistent surfaces. It's just a model of good management and communication. So there's these fishbone diagrams, these kind of cause-effect diagrams. Surface consistency is our goal in this. We're looking at more consistent surfaces. On the right-hand side of your screen there, you see these inputs. They look a lot like what we see in racing. We've got the material, we've got the machines, we've got the measurements, the methods, the manpower, and Mother Nature is the other one on there that was done that way for alliteration. That didn't come from racing. That came from automotive parts improvements in reliability. That's just a standard input diagram. It looks a lot like what we've got in racing. But the assumption has to be that we have the data available in order to reduce variability in each of those inputs. That's the point of the maintenance quality system. The maintenance quality system is an ISO process, ISO-type process. It's not an ISO process. It's developing documentation. There's no paperwork. It's all electronic. Then the key is you have the data available to review good outcomes and questionable outcomes. If there's a question about what happened over the course of a race meet, you go back and after the race meet, or for some of the race meets that go on and on through the entire year, you go back periodically or seasonally and you assess. And then we can have continuous improvement. The idea of continuous improvement for the thoroughbred industry encompasses every aspect of the industry. It encompasses rider safety, it encompasses horse safety, but it also even encompasses the aftercare. Again, every additional horse that we find a new home for, a second job for, that's a benefit to the sport. The equine injury database is being used by a number of racetracks. They're kind of the usual suspects. The equine injury database talks about horses, riders, jurisdiction, and training info, but there's very limited track information. So the idea of the maintenance quality system is to look with these 10 tracks that are already fully participating in it, that we add in design data for the track, track inspection, and then maintenance tracking on a daily basis. If we think about this, it looks a lot like a regulatory oversight that you'd see with drug or aircraft maintenance. What are you going to do? Did you do it? And have you checked it? If it was an airplane, it'd be certifying the design of the plane prior to authorizing its use. Pre-flight inspection, that would be before the race meet, and then monitoring it. That's paying attention and having a pilot paying attention during the flight. So the design documentation and setup begins with the equipment, the target composition, the geometry, and having an on-site weather station at the racetrack. All that's done with specific measurements that are associated with the different types of surfaces. Every race meet, ground penetrating radar is used to inspect the base of the track. Biomechanical surface testing is performed, and the composition is tested to see if it matches the target surface material composition. Again, different tests for the different types of surfaces. Finally, every day during racing, the use of equipment is logged, the cushion is measured, equipment is tracked, and most importantly, moisture is measured for dirt and turf tracks. And again, different measurements for different types of surfaces. This daily measurement is the most difficult. We're to the point where these tracks, well, far more tracks utilize the pre-racing inspection and have the basic work done. The difficult part of this is the day-to-day inspection. But just like you assume that there's going to be a pre-flight inspection, you need to have somebody paying attention when they're in the cockpit to make sure things done. So where we're at right now is we have over a decade of data on some tracks. We've got the biomechanical surface tester, we've got weather stations, and we've got ground penetrating radar. We see big variations from year to year and between tracks as far as performance, the catastrophic injury rate between these tracks, even over the period of time we're looking at. It's the same people, most of the same maintenance. We inspected it before the race meet. We see big differences in the way the tracks perform. The only logical reason for that would be weather variation in the response to weather. Again, none of the goal here is to define what's being done, but to focus on the process and to document the process. So what have we learned? Water matters. Maintaining a wet track, draining a turf track, the response of a turf track, it rains, then and then it dries, and those response and the maintenance, irrigating a turf track or over-irrigating a turf track, and the design and use of water trucks. Moisture and maintenance of response to weather is key to the consistency of a thoroughbred racetrack. The only way we can really begin to learn from this is to have weather stations at the racetrack. Stations are at standard locations and logged to a central database. It doesn't help to have people just looking at a rain gauge, because if you look at a rain gauge, you never get better. You know what the weather was that day. You can't, over the next multiple years, learn what's happening. I got a question during the regulatory vet CE meeting about what was the optimal moisture content. Well, the hard part is actually when it's drying out or when it's just rained, making those critical decisions as to whether to seal a dirt track or to start harrowing a dirt track. That takes a huge amount of data in order to be able to understand risk associated with that. When Dr. Parkin was talking about risk data set, we're talking about the edge cases where the weather is unexpected or changing. That's a very difficult case, and that's a long-term project for us to deal with. So here's what we've found about rainfall. It's not amount. If we look at rainfall over the meet, that's useful. You can look here on these 3 years. We've got 2 inches for 2 years, and then we get 12 inches the third year. Didn't matter, actually. What really mattered, though, was how the rain fell. If you have a single major rain event and the track's sealed, it's not difficult. The track's sealed, the water runs off. The only thing that changes is there was a lot of water running off the parking lot or around the facility. Slow rain is a lot more challenging. We saw this at a couple racetracks, especially when you start talking California racetracks where it's unusual to have rain. The slow rain can be much more difficult and require a much more responsive maintenance crew. And then there's tracks where they have constant rain. So what have we learned over the decade of these weather stations located at these racetracks? Well, our new metric now, when we compare race meet to race meet, is number of 15-minute intervals with measurable rain. The permeability of the turf and the dirt is generally constant, so if it's either wet and raining and permeating in, or it's not. It seems common sense after the fact, but the fact is nobody was doing it. This year was a particularly challenging winter on the dirt tracks, especially in the mid-Atlantic. So what is a challenging winter on a dirt track? Well, the example that's shown up there on the screen right now, day and night, it's cold, warm, cold at night, warm during the day, but it's always above freezing. That's just a wet track, not particularly difficult. This example is a little more challenging. So we're dropping below freezing, 33 degrees Fahrenheit. But what happened here was it froze for a couple days, then thaws after a couple days. So during those transitions, you have to really pay attention. So during those 2 days where it was a frozen track, there's harrows going around the track all night, every night, with tractor drivers in them, keeping the track loose. The trick is when it first starts freezing, you've got to be out there with the crew, you've got to be out there, you've got to keep harrowing the track. And then the next challenge is when you suddenly get above thawing. But you got a couple days to work on it. You might actually lose a day of racing as it's thawing, but it's certainly manageable. Here's what one track that I was working with this winter saw. Freeze every night, thaw every day. So what that really means is, as the ice that you put in the track all night the night before will melt every morning, and so you go from a track that's essentially dry because the water is all ice to something that's soggy. You can add a lot of salt. It looks more like the top left example, but then you have the salt in the track come spring, and you better respond to that quickly. Graham Motion brought up a really good point when he was up here. He started talking about turf races. We talk about the decline of thoroughbred starts or the changes. And that looks like that direction is at least plateaued, maybe even turning the corner. But the key takeaway on this is there's significant differences by surfaces. Most of the decline in starts is on dirt. That's the orange line there. The synthetic, the gray line, it's essentially flat. And that's probably attributable as much to the change from synthetic to dirt as any. We've got a very different story when we start looking at turf. We see an increase both in absolute value of number of starts, but as a percentage, a decade ago, we were only at about 12% of our starts were on turf. Now we're looking at 20% or more are on turf. This is field size, demand, interest, breeding. There's a lot of factors in this that are way above my pay grade, but if we look at this, there's clearly a need for more turf racing opportunities. But also, as Graham Motion said when he was up here with Ed talking earlier, turf doesn't respond the same way a dirt track was. You don't just go out and harrow it afterwards. So what are we going to do? How do we address this? I mean, you remember the inputs are a lot of hard work, the fan experience, materials. The output's got to be more racing, supporting the sport. So we've got a fan demand, a betting demand, an owner demand for turf. How do we do it? Well, we can look at changes to racing schedules. Okay, we have to think hard about those changes, the way the racing schedules. Think about when the grass grows. A lot of this is not very sophisticated, but you got to let the grass grow during the period of the year it grows and not race on it too much when it's dormant. We have turf-only meets. Or here in Kentucky, we've got a turf-only meet. Well, that's a great idea in order to give more turf racing opportunities and give some fresh ground to run over. Improve turf durability. Well, that becomes a very different issue in warm climate grasses, transition zone grasses, or the cool weather grasses. So if we look at the cool weather grasses, at this point I'm not too sure how you increase durability. In the warm climate grasses, we've seen some renovations to some tracks that have addressed that. The other thing that can be done with cool weather grasses is increasing the number or area of turf surfaces at the racetracks. So looking at existing surfaces with warm weather grasses, we have both Del Mar and Santa Anita that completely redid their turf course and invested in this sport. Two major facilities, Woodbine and Aqueduct, have increased their area of turf, addressing specifically the need for more turf racing. What do we need, though? We need to figure out the solution, especially in those transition zones, and look at other opportunities to increase the durability of turf and the design of facilities in order to facilitate better turf racing. But this is still going to come back to weather and maintenance. What methods can we use in order to improve the opportunities for turf racing? What investments can we make in our turf surfaces to address the demand and the interest from the sport? So, how do we respond to customer? We invest in ways to increase safe turf racing. It should be a priority for the sport. We already know it's possible to have a good surface. We've demonstrated that. We have to focus on what we know matters. Open and sealed dirt surfaces, rainfall, moisture content of the track, cushion depth of a dirt track, monitoring the weather. We then need to build, with this data, a culture of collaborative work to improve the surfaces over time. This is discussions between the superintendents using data with the management, and then also working regulatory vet and or the equine medical directors. We also need to improve the data infrastructure. We need affordable solutions for weather stations on all the tracks at the quarter pole. If we look at this overall, this has value to the handicapper, this has value to the track, this has value to everybody. But it's not enough to just put the data out there, and we need to collect the data in a way that we can act on it over time. We need to understand temperature, freeze thaw, and we need to understand water, evaporation rate, permeability, and the ability to cross-drain and properly maintain the surface. But as I mentioned, one of the biggest challenges we've got is the day-to-day measurement of the cushion depth, the moisture, these day in and day out, paying attention to the controls of the airplane. Tracks have made this commitment. Moronius in Montevideo, Uruguay, that you see the picture up there, moisture content measured on both the dirt and the turf every day, cushion depth measured in standard pattern every day. Oakland has committed this year and has been quite successful with taking more data and is now responding to the data. We need more effective measurement of moisture to reduce the labor costs for these and better methods for measuring. But what we do know is at this point, the tracks that have made the commitment to doing this work over the last decade have already pointed out, have pointed the direction forward as to which measurements are needed. We need better tracking of equipment usage. Some racetracks are, ahead of the class. If we look at NYRA, every time a piece of equipment goes out on the track, it goes into the database. It's tracked day in and day out. Santa Anita, Del Mar, Keeneland. The other thing that we're seeing out of this is we see this ongoing innovation. Some modifications of the floats that are used out in California have had a definite improvement in performance. We can't be complacent. We have inadequate daily monitoring at most of the tracks, but we're improving. These three simple steps of weather stations, tracking of equipment, and improved tools for better quality and lower labor cost of moisture and cushion depth is the next step. But I want to go back. If you remember that fishbone diagram, it's not about all technology. We've got to have the right material, we have to have the right measurements, but the people doing the work are absolutely a key element. And like so much of racing, our superintendents at our race courses are an aging workforce. And these people are a key asset in track maintenance. They're the ones who are there on the ground. They're the ones who are making the decisions. And at this point, we are absolutely dependent on their expertise to make those judgment calls when the weather changes. So, how do we build the future? The next step on this is to look around, identify the people in the industry, and build their skills. This is a challenge. It's not popular in the modern economy to invest in your workforce. But we've got the people at some of the racetracks who already get up, do the work. What we need to do is we need to invest in their skill set so that they can do a better job of what they're already doing. We need that next generation. So at this point, we have 6 modules we've identified that are needed for this racecourse manager training program. It's basic equipment usage and track geometry, grader operation, measurement of grades, and turning biomechanics, understanding why you have to grade the track properly, water truck operation and moisture measurement, material composition, testing and interpretation, turf racing, and then communications and leadership. That's probably the hardest, is the last one. Even some of the best superintendents out there sometimes struggle. They know what they need to do, but then they have to communicate it to a very broad group of stakeholders. At this point, we have a steering committee, we've got the academics, and we've got the folks who've been on the ground or are on the ground. But the idea is to bring what we know and implement it in a way that can be used by the industry. So I'll leave you with the idea. Safety is just part of a much bigger story. We've got horse injuries leading into rider injuries. We've got data from the equine injury database, the jockey injury database that needs to be brought into compliance with existing standard data sets. And then what I talked about today, these efforts can bring us forward to produce more consistent racing surfaces. We can't lose sight of why we're doing this. It's an exciting sport. It's a beautiful sport, but we're protecting the participants, both equine and human. That takes a much bigger effort. It takes a coordinated effort, which is a challenge for any industry, but certainly one with all the different racing jurisdictions and all the stakeholders. It becomes a challenge that we need to address, but that we know will be difficult. Thank you very much.
Oh, Ben, would you like to answer one question? We have one. Do you have a moment?
One question.
One question. Aside from the goal of creating and maintaining consistent and safe racetracks, does any racetrack surface research aim towards or consider establishing a fair racetrack that does not play to one running style over another?
So, fairness of the racetrack is very closely related to consistency. And we can talk fairness, certainly. One of the major fairness issues is inconsistency from the rail out. The most typical cause of a fast rail would be a variation in cushion depth or moisture content. Those were the two key measurements that we make. The other fairness issue or performance issue that's key, I believe, is kickback. And it's one of the reasons that the response to turf, and certainly moving dirt horses to turf, becomes important. You're not going to be particularly surprised that my approach to changing kickback on a dirt surface is water is the single most important variable that will affect kickback. So if we're controlling moisture, we're doing the best thing that we can do through the race card to keep a consistent surface. And if you see a fairness issue evolving over the course of a race card, it's probably a moisture issue. All right, thank you.